In the spring of 1961, at a grim farm liquidation sale outside of Pratt, Kansas, a 9-year-old girl named Dela Puit paid 35 cents for a battered Maxwell house can brimming with rusted horseshoes. Not a curated collection, not a few salvageable pieces someone had set aside, a large can packed with shoes pulled from dead horses and flung into a corner of a barn that hadn't seen a broom since Eisenhower's first term. The shoes were fused together by decades of corrosion. Some still bore nails driven through the holes. 2 were cracked clean through the toe, split by a horse that had stumbled on frozen ground and never risen again. The man running the sale, a fellow named Burlak who handled liquidations for 3 counties, nearly discarded the can without a thought. He held it up by the bale and said, and these are his exact words, "Any fool want this dead weight?" Dela Puit raised her hand. She had 35 cents in her coat pocket, 2 dimes, a nickel, and 2 pennies, and she laid all of it on the tailgate of Burlak's truck. The men standing around the back of that sale laughed, not cruel laughter, but the kind that erupts from an absolute, unshakable conviction that what you are witnessing is the most absurd spectacle Pratt County, Kansas has seen in recent memory. A little girl in a wool coat paying 35 cents for a can of rusted horseshoes at a dead man's farm sale. The story made it from the sale to the feed store on Main Street before sundown. By week's end, it had reached the co-op out on Highway 54, the diner by the grain elevator, and the parking lot of First Baptist, where it was told with the patronizing indulgence that small farming communities reserve for children who commit bewildering eccentricities. They said Harlon Puit's youngest had squandered her whole allowance on scrap iron. They said she'd hauled that can home in her lap, cradling it like treasure. They said she'd stored it in the barn like she was hoarding something precious. They laughed for years in that cruel, casual way people laugh at things they deem inconsequential. They stopped laughing in 1979. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let me tell you about Dela Puit, because what she did with those horseshoes, and with everything that came after, only makes sense if you understand who she was, and who taught her to see the way she saw. Dela Jean Puit was born in 1952 on a dryland wheat farm 4 miles east of Pratt, Kansas, on 320 acres her grandfather had torn from native grass in 1923. The farm sat on ground flat enough to see weather coming from 40 miles, and honest enough to tell you immediately when you had aired. Her father, Harlon Puit, was not a large man and not a loud one, but he was the most capable person Dela had ever known, and she spent her childhood trying to decipher exactly how he performed what he did. Harlon had grown up watching his own father repair everything with whatever lay at hand, and he had taken that philosophy further than most men of his generation deemed necessary. He did not believe in buying new what could be forged from old. He did not believe in paying another to do what he could master himself. And he did not, under any circumstances, believe in debt. His shop was a concrete block building behind the house, 40 feet long and 20 wide, with a corrugated tin roof and a wood stove in the corner that he fed with hedge wood every morning from October through April. The workbench along the north wall was built from 2-inch oak planks he had milled himself from a tree blown down in the 1944 windstorm, and it ran the full length of the building. Above it, on pegboard he had cut and mounted himself, hung tools arranged by function and size with a specificity that made the shop feel less like a workspace and more like a sanctum. The forge in the southeast corner he had bought second-hand from a retiring blacksmith in Kingman in 1938. The post vise bolted to the bench end had come from an estate sale in 1941. The drill press in the middle of the floor he had acquired in 1947 from a Wichita machine shop upgrading its equipment, hauling it home in his truck wrapped in burlap. Every tool in that shop bore a history, and Harlon Puit knew them all, recounting them to Dela the way other fathers told bedtime stories. What Harlon taught Dela was not a trade exactly. It was a way of seeing. He taught her that every piece of metal held a history and a potential use that had nothing to do with its current condition. He taught her that rust was not death, it was merely time, and time could be reversed with heat, work, and the right abrasive. He taught her that the chasm between scrap and material was determined solely by the eyes beholding it. He showed her how to read the grain of iron, how to distinguish a shoe that had been well made from one that had been rushed, how to feel in a piece of metal whether it had been worked hot or cold, and what that meant for what you could coax from it next. The horseshoe, he told her once, standing at the forge with a shoe he was reshaping for one of their own horses, is one of the most precisely engineered objects in everyday use on a farm. The weight, the width, the angle of the heel cocks, the placement of the nail holes, all of it is specific to the horse, the terrain, the work. A good horseshoe is no simple thing. It is the result of someone knowing exactly what was needed and possessing the skill to create it. He set the shoe on the anvil and studied it. Most people see a horseshoe and they see good luck, he said. I see 4 decades of metallurgical mastery. Dela was 11 when he said that. She did not forget it. She was good in school, good enough that her teachers told Harlon she ought to consider college. And there was a period when she was 17 that she actually considered it, when a guidance counselor in Pratt had handed her a brochure for Kansas State, and she had studied it for 2 weeks before sliding it into her nightstand drawer. The farm was the farm. Her 2 older brothers, Gene and Dale, had both left by then, Gene to Wichita, Dale chasing a girl to Oklahoma City. And the work had shifted to Dela and her father by a process so gradual she had not noticed it happening until it was already done. By 18, she was running the wheat harvest alongside Harlon. By 20, she was handling the books. By 22, when Harlon's heart began to falter and the doctor in Pratt told him he needed to slow down, she was running the farm while Harlon retreated to the shop. Harlon Puit died in March of 1974 on a Tuesday morning in the shop. He had been rebuilding a water pump for a neighbor's irrigation rig, a favor he had offered because the neighbor was behind and the season was coming. Dela found him at the workbench, coffee cup still warm in her hand. He had finished the pump. It sat on the bench beside him, cleaned and reassembled, ready to install. Dela noted this. She noted it the way her father had taught her to note things, without sentiment, but with precision. He had completed the job. That was the kind of man he was. She inherited the farm. 320 acres, paid for. The shop and everything in it. A savings account in the Pratt County Bank with $14,200 accumulated over 40 years of her father's absolute refusal to spend money he did not possess. No mortgage. No equipment loans. No debt of any kind. At 22, Dela Puit was the sole owner of a paid-for farm in Pratt County, Kansas, and she intended to keep it that way. Her brother Gene drove down from Wichita for the funeral, stayed 3 days, and suggested carefully that she might want to consider selling. Not all of it, just enough to give herself some operating room. She thanked him and said she'd think about it. She did not sell. Now, the horseshoes. When Dela Puit looked at that coffee can she had hauled home from the sale in 1961, she did not see what everyone else saw. She had not seen what everyone else saw since she was 9 years old, standing at her father's forge watching him work a shoe back to useful shape from something that had looked like junk. What she saw in that can was untapped potential. Specifically, she saw high-carbon iron that had been shaped and worked and tempered by masters who knew exactly what they were doing, abandoned for a mere 35 cents because everyone around her had stopped seeing it. By the time she was 12, she had a system. Liquidation sales, estate sales, farm clearances, anywhere horseshoes surfaced in the miscellaneous piles that auctioneers bundled together because they deemed them unworthy of effort. She bought every lot she could afford with her allowance, and later with money she earned helping neighbors with harvest. She sorted them by size, by condition, by the style of the nail holes, by the weight of the iron. She kept them in coffee cans on a shelf her father had built for her along the east wall of the shop, labeled in her own handwriting. By 16, she had over 200 shoes sorted and catalogued. By the time Harlon died, she had over 600. Nobody in Pratt County knew this. The story they remembered was the little girl at the sale. They did not know she had been buying horseshoes for 13 years. That's why no one foresaw the storm she was brewing. They were seeing a woman hoarding worthless scrap. They were actually watching the first calculated stroke of a plan that had been running since 1961. Let me tell you about the rebuild, because this is where Dela Puit proved that inherited wisdom and relentless patience can solve a problem that money alone cannot. In the fall of 1974, 6 months after Harlon's death, Dela drove to a farm outside Medicine Lodge in Barber County and bought a champion No. 1 post vise that had been rotting in a collapsed shed for unknown years. She paid $8 for it. She had spotted it listed in the Pratt County newspaper under farm items, miscellaneous, and she had driven 45 minutes each way on a weekday morning to inspect it before calling. The jaws were warped and gaping. The screw was frozen solid. The mounting plate was cracked along one edge, but not through the critical section. She bought it, loaded it herself into her truck bed, and drove home. 3 months before that, she had driven to a retired farrier in Kingman County named Eldon Schrock who was selling his equipment, and she bought his entire set of Pritchell tools, his turning hammer, his driving hammer, his nail pullers, and his clenching block. She paid $22 for the lot. Eldon Schrock was 81 and had been shoeing horses in that county since 1918, and he spent 2 hours painstakingly explaining each tool, demonstrating how he used it. She sat on a hay bale, absorbing every syllable, interrupting not once. She had been planning this for a while. The vision was devastatingly simple, but the execution required everything her father had taught her. Pratt County in the mid-1970s still relied on working horses, not many, but enough. Quarter horses for cattle work, a few draft crosses that older farmers kept out of habit or sentiment, and the horses that the county's small but persistent community of ranchers used for actual daily labor. These horses needed shoes. The nearest working farrier was in Kingman, 40 miles away, and he was backlogged 6 to 8 weeks deep and charged accordingly. There was a void, and Dela had been watching it since she was old enough to understand what a void meant. She spent the winter of 1974 and the spring of 1975 in her father's shop, laboring. She repaired the champion vise using a welding technique her father had shown her for cracked cast iron, slow heat, the right rod, slower cooling, and mounted it to the end of the bench where his had always stood. She freed the frozen screw with penetrating oil and heat and 2 days of patience. She restored Eldon Schrock's tools with the wire wheel on the bench grinder and linseed oil on the handles. She fired the forge for the first time since her father's death, and she worked through her collection of horseshoes, sorting again, this time by the iron quality she could feel when she worked them hot, setting aside the ones that had the right carbon content for reshaping, and the ones that were too far gone, destined only as raw stock. The material cost of this operation was as follows: the champion vise, 8, Eldon Schrock's tool lot, 22. Forge coal, 14 for the first winter supply. Welding rod and flux for the vise repair, 3.40. Wire wheel replacement for the bench grinder, 2.10. Linseed oil and handle stock for tool restoration, 4. Miscellaneous hardware, clips, nails, rasps, and a new file set, 31. Total, 84.50, plus the 35 cents she had paid at the sale 13 years earlier for the raw material that made the entire operation possible. 84.85. The standard rate for a farrier call in Pratt County in 1975 was 18 to 22 per horse, plus mileage from Kingman. A rancher with 6 working horses was paying $130 or more every 6 to 8 weeks, plus the weight. Dela charged $14 a horse, no mileage, and she could usually reach you within the week. The first horse she shod professionally belonged to a rancher named Virgil Yansy, who ran cattle on a section and a half east of Pratt and who had been waiting 9 weeks for the Kingman farrier to reach him. His lead cutting horse had cast 2 shoes and was favoring its left fore, and Virgil was a man of volcanic impatience. His wife had heard from someone at the co-op that Harlon Puit's daughter was doing farrier work, and Virgil had driven out to the Puit place on a Wednesday morning, driven by desperation, not faith. He stood at the fence and watched Dela work. She had the horse in the cross ties in the barn aisle, and she labored with the methodical precision of someone who had been doing this for years, which, in a certain sense, she had, because her father had shod their own horses her entire childhood, and she had been watching and helping since she was tall enough to be useful. She cleaned the hoof, assessed the angle, selected a shoe from her sorted stock that was close to the right size, worked it hot on the forge to the precise fit, set it, nailed it, and clenched the nails with a precision that Virgil Yansy, who had been around horses his entire life, recognized instantly as the handiwork of a master. He removed his hat slowly. He scrubbed the back of his neck with it. He looked at the horse, then at Dela, then at the horse again. "You learned that from Harlon," he said. "Harlon," she said, "and about 600 horseshoes." He pressed 14 into her palm and drove home, and told 3 neighboring ranchers what he had seen. Not the story from the sale, something different. Ranchers telling fellow ranchers about something they had witnessed firsthand. The story that traveled this time was not about a little girl squandering her allowance. It was about a woman who had been preparing for 15 relentless years and was ready. Let me tell you about what happened over the next several years, because this is where the story stops being about horseshoes and starts being about something else entirely. If you have ever watched a community underestimate a quiet force for years and then have to silently recalibrate everything it thought it knew, stick with me. By 1978, Dela Puit had built a farrier operation that tended 43 horses across 4 counties. She had not advertised. She had not taken out a loan to buy new equipment. She had not upgraded to a truck-mounted forge or a professional anvil stand or any of the accessories that the farrier supply catalogs were selling to people who wanted to look professional. She had her father's shop, her father's forge, her sorted collection of raw stock, and a set of skills she had been accumulating since she was old enough to hold a hammer. Her overhead was coal, nails, and rasps. Her truck was paid for. Her farm was paid for. She was putting between $4,000 and $6,000 a year into the Pratt County Bank on top of what the wheat ground produced, and she was doing it unburdened by debt. The men at the feed store had stopped telling the story about the sale by then, not because they had understood what she was doing, but because they had forgotten about it, the way communities forget things that don't fit the narrative they're already spinning. The story they were telling in the late 1970s in Pratt County was about expansion. Land prices were climbing. Commodity prices were strong. The operating logic of the county had shifted to a simple equation: borrow to expand. Expand to produce. Produce to pay the loan. Borrow more. Neighbors who had farmed 200 acres were farming 500. Men who had owned 1 tractor were buying 3. The implement dealer in Pratt was doing the best business he had seen since the war. And the bank on Main Street was doing better than that. Everyone was erecting empires on credit, and credit flowed like water, and the future seemed boundless. Dela watched this from the Puit place with the same expression she used for weather: watchful, impassive, not with satisfaction and not with alarm, but with the steely focus of someone who had been taught to read the terrain and deduce the truth without letting hope or terror corrupt the math. By 1979, she had $47,000 in the bank. The farm was paid for. The shop was paid for. The truck was paid for. Her expenses were coal, nails, rasps, wheat seed, fuel, and the property tax on 320 acres, and they came to the same number every year within a few hundred because she had structured her operation so that nothing in it could change without her deciding to change it. There was no variable she hadn't foreseen. There was no debt that could be recalled. You know what 18 interest rates savaged. You know what corn at 1.85 and wheat at 3 did to fragile cash flow projections that had been built on 5 corn and 5 wheat? You know what it looked like when land values that had soared for a decade cratered? In Pratt County, Kansas, between 1981 and 1986, 11 farms were devoured by auction, not liquidation sales, predatory foreclosure auctions. The bank on Main Street clutching the notes, the sheriff posting the notice, and the neighbors standing in the yard watching a family's legacy dismantled acre by acre. Virgil Yansy lost the east half of his section in 1983. He had borrowed against it in 1978 to buy equipment, and when the note came due, the land was worth less than the loan, and the equipment was worth less than that. He was no fool. He was no careless man. He had done what the bank had told him made sense. What the extension office had told him was the modern approach. What every neighbor around him had been doing and calling progress. Not because he was reckless, but because the entire economic fabric of the county had been woven from delusions, and he had built inside that fabric the same as everyone else. Dela's expenses remained ironclad. They couldn't change. There was no fat to trim because there had never been anything borrowed to cut back to. She watched the auctions with somber vigil, and she kept working. In the fall of 1983, the 160 acres adjacent to the Puit place on the east went to foreclosure auction. It was the Schrock ground, prime wheat land, flat and fertile, with a reliable irrigation well in the northeast corner that Dela's father had helped Eldon Schrock's father drill in 1951. The bank had set the opening bid at $280 per acre, below the land's former glory, yet beyond what most of the broken men standing at that auction were willing to pay in 1983, because most of them were already drowning in debt, and adding more required a confidence the times had shattered. There were two other bidders, a vulture from Wichita who had been circling the foreclosure circuit, and a farmer from the next county who had come hoping to scavenge cheap land. The vulture opened at $280. The farmer went to $295. The vulture went to $310. Dela said, $340. The vulture looked at her. The farmer looked at her. The auctioneer looked at her and said, "Do I hear $350? Nobody said $350. The ground was hers. 160 acres at $340 per acre. $54,400. She wrote a check on the Pratt County bank account that had held $47,000 18 months earlier and now held $61,200 because she had kept putting money in and nothing had required her to take any out. The crowd at that auction fell into a deathly hush. Not the polite quiet of people waiting for the next item, the suffocating silence that falls when a community must confront its own blindness and shatter every assumption it had clung to simultaneously. People who had been standing in small groups talking looked at each other, then at Dela, then at the ground. The vulture from Wichita put his catalog in his coat pocket and retreated to his car. The farmer from the next county stood there for a moment, then walked over to where Dela was signing the paperwork. "I knew your father," he said. "Most people did," she said. He nodded at the ground they were standing on. "He would have savored this," he said. She signed the last page and looked up. "He foresaw this moment," she said. "I simply had to wait for the world to come to its senses." The story that came out of that auction was not the one from the sale. It was a different kind of story, the kind that spreads like wildfire yet lands heavier, because it forces people to confront their own blindness in the telling. It went from the auction to the feed store and from the feed store to the co-op and from the co-op to the diner, and at every stop it was whispered with a reverence bordering on awe, because the people telling it were not laughing now. They were trying to understand something. Let me tell you how this ends, because the ending is the part Harlon Puit would have grasped in an instant, needing no explanation. Dela Puit commanded 480 acres of unencumbered land in Pratt County, Kansas for the next 2 decades. She kept the farrier work until the mid-1990s, when her niece told her that bending over horses' feet for a living had a natural term limit, and she winnowed it down to the horses she chose to work on and the neighbors she had been serving since Virgil Yansy's cutting horse in 1975. The shop behind the house remained frozen in time, exactly as her father had built it, with his tools on the pegboard above the bench, and the forge in the southeast corner, and the champion vise at the end of the bench where she had welded it back together in 1974. The coffee cans of sorted horseshoes stayed on the east wall shelf. She did not remove them. Her niece, Jean's youngest daughter, a girl named Cassie, who carried more of Harlon's spirit than her father had ever manifested, started spending summers on the farm when she was 12. By 14, she was in the shop every morning before breakfast, and Dela had initiated her on the drill press the same way Harlon had started Dela, with a lump of scrap iron and a cryptic set of instructions and the expectation that she would divine the rest. Cassie was 15 the first time she fired the forge herself, and Dela stood in the doorway and watched her coax a piece of stock, saying nothing because there was nothing to say. The girl had it, the identical eye, the identical patience, the identical instinct for what the metal wanted to do and what it needed to be made to do. Harlon's way of seeing, transmitted Unbroken across 2 generations through a concrete block shop on a wheat farm in Pratt County, Kansas. In 1997, Dela was asked to speak at the Pratt County Farm Bureau annual meeting. She was 45, she had been farming paid-for ground for 23 years, and she was no lover of podiums. She went because they asked, and because she thought she had something worth saying. She stood at the podium for about 3 minutes. She had no notes. "I want to ask you something," she said. "When you gaze upon a piece of scrap iron, what do you truly see? Most of you see a corpse of what once was. You see what it used to be and can't be anymore. My father taught me to see what it could yet become if somebody was willing to do the work. He taught me that the chasm between scrap and material is determined solely by the eyes beholding it. And the same truth governs land, time, and wealth. I have been farming this county for 23 years without a mortgage, without an equipment loan, without a line of credit. And I have witnessed good men lose everything they had toiled their entire lives to build, because the banks demanded blood when the markets offered none. I am no cleverer than those men. I am no better farmer than most of them. I merely had a father who taught me that ownership is the only fortress no bank can breach. And I believed him. That's all I have." She stepped back from the podium. Virgil Yansy was in the 3rd row. He had leased back half his ground from the investment company that had bought it at the foreclosure auction, and he was still farming, which said something about his stubbornness that Dela had always respected. He caught her eye when she sat down and nodded at her, the slow, deliberate nod of a man who had wrestled with a truth for years and finally surrendered to it. She nodded back. That was the whole conversation, and it was enough. Cassie Puit took over the day-to-day operation of the farm in 2004. She was 26. The shop was hers. The forge was hers. The tools on the pegboard were hers. And the coffee cans of sorted horseshoes on the east wall shelf were hers, though she had added to them considerably, because she had inherited not just the collection but the habit of seeing what other people walked past. The farm was paid for. The equipment was paid for. There was no debt. The Pratt County bank account held a balance that Dela declined to discuss publicly, but that her accountant described once to a colleague as astonishing for a farm operation of that scale. What do you see when you look at a coffee can full of rusted horseshoes? Most people see 35 cents of worthless scrap. Harlon Puit saw 4 decades of metallurgical mastery. Dela Puit saw the genesis of an empire. The entire county of Pratt saw a foolish girl squandering her allowance at a dead man's farm sale, and they laughed about it for years. And they fell silent when she wrote a check for $54,400 on a Tuesday morning in 1983 and bought the ground next door while the rest of the county was drowning in payments for what they already owned. 35 cents. A coffee can. A forge that had been burning in the same corner of the same shop since 1938. The unwanted horseshoes in the hands of the woman no one comprehended, until the bank held the auction, and the crowd went quiet, and the only sound was a pen moving across a check.